200 years ago, China was one of the most powerful countries in the world. But by the middle of the 19th century, everything started to change. Foreign armies were entering Chinese cities. The government was losing control. How did China go from one of the world's greatest empires to a country struggling to survive? The answer begins with a mistake that many great powers have made before. China believed the world would continue working the same way it always had, but the world had already changed. Europe was industrializing. Steam-powered ships were crossing oceans. New weapons were changing warfare. The countries that adapted fastest were gaining an advantage. Chinese goods were highly valued around the world. Tea from China was a luxury product in Britain. For centuries, China had been a major economic and cultural power. But while China was looking back at its long history, another part of the world was moving in a completely different direction. In the early 1800s, the Qing Dynasty ruled over China. It was one of the largest empires on Earth. Chinese goods were highly valued around the world. Silk and porcelain were symbols of wealth across Europe. But while China was looking back at its long history, Europe was industrializing. Factories were replacing traditional workshops. New weapons were changing warfare. The countries that adapted fastest were gaining an advantage. But inside the Qing court, many officials believed China already had everything it needed. They saw foreign countries as outsiders coming to trade with China. The idea that China needed to learn from them was difficult to accept, and that belief would soon become extremely costly. The first major clash between China and the industrial world did not begin with soldiers, it began with tea. In the 18th century, Britain developed a huge appetite for Chinese tea. British people loved it. The problem was that China did not want many British products in return. Chinese merchants wanted silver. Money was constantly flowing from Britain into China. British leaders wanted to change this situation. Their solution was opium. British traders began bringing opium from India into China. The trade was illegal, but the profits were enormous. The consequences inside China became impossible to ignore. The government became increasingly worried that the problem was damaging society and the economy. In 1839, the Qing emperor sent Lin Zexu to Canton. His mission was simple: stop the opium trade. Lin confiscated and destroyed large amounts of British opium. For China, this was an attempt to protect the country. For Britain, it threatened a profitable trade. The disagreement quickly turned into war. The First Opium War began in 1839. China discovered something it had not fully understood. The world had changed. China had a large army, but Britain had industrial technology. British ships could move faster. Their weapons were more advanced. China was fighting a new type of war with an old system. The result was devastating. In 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking. China had to pay compensation. Several ports were open to foreign trade. Hong Kong was handed over to Britain. But the most damaging part was not only the territory China lost. It was the realization that the old order was no longer enough. The First Opium War was only the beginning. After China lost to Britain, other countries realized something important. The Qing Dynasty was vulnerable. Foreign powers began demanding more influence inside China. In 1856, another conflict started, the Second Opium War. This time, Britain was joined by France. Foreign troops moved toward Beijing. In 1860, they entered the capital. They destroyed the old summer palace. For many Chinese people, this moment represented something deeper than losing a battle. It showed that China was no longer able to fully control what was happening inside its own country. The Qing government tried to respond. Officials launched what became known as the self-strengthening movement. They built shipyards. They created modern factories. They purchased Western weapons. They sent students overseas to study science and technology. But there was a major problem. China was trying to modernize its equipment, Without completely changing the system behind it, China could buy new weapons. But building a modern country required more than weapons. It required new knowledge, better institutions, and the ability to adapt. Japan had taken a completely different path. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan rapidly transformed itself. It built modern industries. It created a new military. It studied Western technology. China moved slowly. Japan moved quickly. The difference became clear during the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. China had a much larger population and a long history. But Japan's modern military defeated the Qing forces. China lost control of Taiwan. It lost influence over Korea. Once again, the world saw that the Qing Dynasty was weaker than it appeared. By the beginning of the 20th century, the problems were becoming impossible to ignore. The government was losing trust. Foreign powers were demanding more control. Many ordinary people were struggling with poverty. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion created another crisis. The movement attacked foreign influence in China. The Qing government eventually supported the rebellion. The result was another foreign invasion. An alliance of 8 countries sent troops into China. They occupied Beijing. The Qing government was forced to accept another humiliating settlement. For many Chinese people, this became proof that the old dynasty could no longer protect the country. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed. After more than 2,000 years of imperial rule, China became a republic. Many hoped this would finally begin a new chapter. But instead, China entered another period of instability. Different military leaders controlled different regions. The central government struggled to maintain authority. The country was divided. And then, an even greater crisis arrived. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The war lasted 8 years. Millions of people died. Cities were destroyed. The country once again faced the possibility of collapse. But something unexpected happened during these years. A divided population began to develop a stronger sense of shared identity. The experience of foreign invasion created a powerful belief. China could never allow itself to become weak again. The century of humiliation had become more than a period of suffering. It became a memory that would influence China's future. When the Second World War ended, China's problems were not finished. The war against Japan had destroyed much of the country. After Japan's defeat, the Chinese Civil War resumed. In 1949, the Communist Party won the Civil War. On October 1st, Mao Zedong announced the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. After decades of conflict, China was unified again under a central government. But unification did not mean China was immediately strong. The country faced enormous challenges. The economy was weak. Most people still lived in rural areas. The country needed to rebuild almost everything. The new government focused on rebuilding basic industries. Steel, energy, and transportation became national priorities. But rebuilding a country of hundreds of millions of people was not simple. China still lacked technology and resources. Then came another major transformation. In 1978, China began a new era of reform and opening up. This decision would change China's future. Millions of farmers would soon enter a completely different economic system. China was about to begin the fastest economic transformation in its modern history. But the path ahead was still uncertain. The first major change happened in the countryside. For decades, farmers had worked under the collective farming system. Individual families had limited control over what they produced. Then some villages began experimenting with a new idea. Families would take responsibility for their own land. If they produced more, they could keep more. This simple change created a powerful incentive. Agricultural production began to rise. For many rural families, life slowly started improving. But the changes did not stop in the countryside. A new wave of small businesses began appearing. These became known as township and village enterprises. They created jobs outside traditional farming. Millions of people started moving from farms into factories. This was the beginning of China's massive industrial transformation. But industrialization needed more than workers. China also needed foreign investment and global connections. This led to the creation of special economic zones. Shenzhen became the most famous example. At the time, few people imagined what it would become. Foreign companies began moving production to China. Chinese workers learned new manufacturing skills. Production expanded at an incredible speed. Millions of jobs were created. Rural families began sending their children to cities. This created one of the largest movements of people in modern history. China was no longer only a farming country, it was becoming the world's manufacturing center. The transformation was happening faster than almost anyone expected. But China's rise was not only about factories and exports. It was also about building a completely new economic system. Millions of people changed their lives through this process. A poor rural country was becoming an industrial power. But China's development story was not finished. The next challenge was becoming a global competitor. China began moving from low-cost manufacturing toward advanced industries. Education and technology became increasingly important. Cities became the center of China's transformation. Millions moved into urban areas. Their lives became very different from previous generations. China had transformed itself through decades of difficult choices. The journey from weakness to strength took more than one generation. It was built through wars, reforms, failures, and experiments. The country that once struggled to survive became one of the world's largest economies. But understanding China's rise requires looking beyond the numbers. China's rise was not a straight line of success. It was a long process filled with difficult decisions. From the Opium Wars to reform and opening up, every period shaped the next one. The humiliation of the past influenced the determination of the future. China's leaders repeatedly focused on one question: how to make the country stronger. Different generations answered that question in different ways. Some focused on military strength. Others focused on economic development. The common goal was survival, independence, and modernization. Today, China looks completely different from the country of the 19th century. The cities, industries, and technology sectors show how much has changed. But the story is not simply about becoming powerful. It is also about how a country responds after experiencing decline. China's history shows how countries can change when facing extraordinary pressure. The transformation took more than 100 years. It began with a powerful empire that failed to adapt to a changing world. It continued through wars, losses, and national rebuilding, and it eventually became one of the largest transformations in modern history. The story of China is not only about economic growth, it is about how a society changes after experiencing a century of crisis. For many Chinese people, the memory of weakness shaped the desire for strength. The past became a lesson that influenced the future. China's rise was built through millions of individual stories: farmers who changed their fields, workers who built factories, entrepreneurs who created new businesses, engineers and students who built new knowledge. Together, these people transformed the country. The process was complicated, with both achievements and challenges. But the transformation itself changed China's place in the world. The transformation also created new challenges. Rapid growth brought opportunities and pressure at the same time. Millions of people improved their living standards. But development also changed the way people lived and worked. Rural villages became connected to global markets. Small factories became part of worldwide supply chains. A country once isolated became deeply connected with the world. This change happened within a single generation. A child born in a poor village could grow up in a modern city. That was one of the most dramatic social changes in modern history. However, China's rise also changed the balance of the global economy. Manufacturing shifted toward China on a massive scale. Chinese cities became major centers of production. The country that once struggled with foreign pressure became a major global player. But understanding this transformation requires looking beyond simple success stories. China's development story contains both remarkable achievements and difficult questions. It shows how a country can rebuild itself after a period of decline. The century of humiliation was a turning point in China's modern history. It changed how generations of Chinese people viewed their country and its future. From the Qing Dynasty to modern China, the transformation took more than 100 years. It was shaped by wars, reforms, failures, and experiments. Millions of ordinary people became part of this transformation. Their choices and efforts changed the direction of the country. China's rise was not created overnight. It was the result of generations of change. The country that once struggled against foreign pressure became a major force in the world. But the most important part of this story is understanding how the transformation happened. China's journey from weakness to strength was a long and complicated process. It was a story of adaptation, survival, and transformation. And that is why China's rise remains one of the most significant stories of the modern world. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more moments that shaped our world, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story.